Good morning, everyone. I think we can get started while it's the top of the hour. So as many of you have joined or listened to webinars before, we're doing a series of webinars to share the guidance from the ad hoc technical group on indicators that's been developed for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework Monitoring Framework. Today, we are not going to be talking about any specific indicator. Many of the webinars have been looking at specific indicators, but the AdTech has developed an approach to trying to assess the coverage of the full scope of the monitoring framework vis-a-vis what is needed in order to effectively monitor the goals and the targets. And so the co-chair of the AdTech, James William, is going to give a presentation on what the monitoring framework, how it works and how we've identified the gaps. And then he will be joined by Flavio Affinito, who's been supporting this work, and Tim Hirsch, who's also been providing a lot of the guidance for this assessment as one of the AdTech members. So James, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gillian, and I will just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. If you could just confirm that that's come full screen for you, I'd be grateful.
Yep.
Yep, excellent. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever in the world you may be. This is one of a series of webinars, as Gillian was saying, and we're trying to make sure that people have the opportunity to quiz us about the work that the AdTech has done and to share the results as broadly as we can, and hence the reason for recording these webinars. There will also be a workshop on the 11th of May in Nairobi that we will be presenting more general results to. We won't have time to go into all of the detail of all of the webinars, but we are interested to make sure that people understand the work that the AdTech has done to lead into the negotiations at SBSTA 26 and also, of course, at COP16 as well. So in terms of this webinar, we've got a general introduction from myself. We've then got some information from Tim about breaking the targets and goals into elements and how that was done. And then Flavia will take us through the methods and the results of the analysis. And then, of course, we'll open it up for question and answers. And please do ask questions and answers in the chat. I can't see anything while I'm sharing my screen, but we will be passing things between us. So hopefully by the time we get to questions and answers, that will not be a problem. So a quick reminder to start off with that the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework covers an enormous amount of ground. It has 4 goals that are to be achieved by 2050, and I don't intend to go through the detail of those. That's another webinar in its own right to be able to go through the detail of the individual goals or indeed the individual targets. And there are 23 targets to be achieved by 2030, broken into 3 general groups about reducing the threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and through tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. But each of those targets is itself very complicated. I've given just as an example target 3 here, and there are quite a lot of different elements. I think it's 11 in target 3, all of which in theory are things that parties and observers need to be addressing in order to achieve the target overall. So Tim will describe how we've gone through and broken these targets down into individual elements in order to be able to identify how well the monitoring framework covers the whole scope of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in detail. So just to remind you that the Decision 15.5 established the monitoring framework and Decision 15.4 established the Global Biodiversity Framework. Decision 15.5 also established an AdTech, an ad hoc technical expert group, which I've had the honor of co-chairing with Maria Cecilia Londono Murcia from Colombia. And we've had 45 experts selected by the SBSTA Bureau from approximately 260 applications, and some really good expertise and engagement with the work that we have been undertaking. The mandate that we had has been huge, and I'll come on to a little bit more detail about Part A in just a moment. But I wanted to stress with this slide that it's not just about the technical advice, but also guidance in terms of how the indicators can be used in a variety of ways, and including advice on existing capacity, gaps and needs. And Part A of that mandate includes the phrase here about supporting the work to address critical gaps to improve the monitoring framework. And when we started undertaking work on this, there was a little bit of difference of interpretation, shall we say, in terms of whether that critical gaps meant that we were to be looking at suggesting headline indicators for targets for which headline indicators were not agreed in decision 15.5, for example. And we brought that back to SBSA 25 in order to get advice on interpretation of our mandate, because clearly we wanted to make sure as an RTEG that we were delivering what parties were looking for, but clearly we didn't want to overreach and suggest things that were not what they were asking for. So it's SBSA 25 recommendation 1, the second paragraph requests the expert group to continue the work in the variety of detail in there in subparagraphs A1 to 3. And the critical point here is, and time permitting, on elements of goals and targets not currently covered by the headline indicator. And that is where this gap analysis has come from in terms of trying to fulfill an extra piece of mandate that we were asked to undertake by SBSA 25. At that point, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass over to Tim. I've got questions there, but in fact, we'll have questions at the end. So, Tim, if I can hand over to you at that point, please.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, James. It's a great pleasure to be presenting at this webinar. I'm just going to share my own screen now, and hopefully you are now seeing the first of my slides, title slides. Good. So my name is Tim Hirsch. I'm the Deputy Director of GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, but speaking today as a member of the RTEG, and it's been a tremendous privilege to be working among such an amazingly skilled and wide-ranging group in terms of talents. One of the elements that I've been working on, particularly within the RTEG, is to look at and really to try to implement an approach to this division of the present goals and targets of the framework into what we've described as elements for the purposes of this gap analysis. Sorry, I'm just going to try and work out why. Here we are, going to advance my slide. There we go. Just before we do that, I think it'd be good just to have a little bit of a flashback to the handling of the Aichi biodiversity targets, of course, in the decade for biodiversity leading up to 2020. Many of you will be familiar with and remember this chart, which was included within GBO5, the fifth Global Biodiversity Outlook, which of course reported on the level of achievement of those targets. And what you will notice in the very colourful dashboard assessment you can see on the right is that each of the targets is divided up into these segments of a semicircle, which were indeed the elements that had been identified earlier in the process at the time of the midterm review in GBO4, that looked at logically the wording of the targets and what that implied for the different components or elements that would need to be achieved if the whole of the target could said to have been met. Having identified those elements, and there were in the end a total of 60 within the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, the approach in GBO5 as to the level of achievement of those targets was based on which and how many, if any, of those elements within the targets could be said to have been achieved. And looking at the color coding here, just as a reminder, if an element of a segment is red, it means essentially there was no progress to 2020. If it was yellow, there was progress, but not sufficient to meet the target. If it was green, that element of the target was said to have been achieved. Blue, in fact, is where there was overachievement, and purple is where things were judged to have got worse over the decade. And it was this division up into the elements that enabled the final conclusion of GBO5, which was that none of the 20 targets could be said to have been fully achieved, and 6 were partially met, partially achieved. And the definition of that was that for a target to have been fully achieved, it would have to be completely green. And for a target to be partially achieved or partially met, at least one of those segments, one of those elements needed to be green or blue for overachievement. And that's what gave rise to this sort of headline conclusion about the level of achievement of biodiversity targets. So I'm just pointing that out because it demonstrates the way in which the concept of dividing targets up into elements was already a very important part of the process of being able to report overall on progress towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. So as we take this to the present situation, what's the purpose of dividing up these targets and goals into elements now, given that that was something which only happened about halfway through the decade leading up to 2020? Well, for a start, as James has pointed out, the wording of the goals and the targets are in many cases highly complex. And if one advantage of going through this exercise now is to cast ourselves forward, if you like, to, let's say we're in 2030 in the case of the targets, or 2050 in the case of the goals. How would we start to evaluate the achievement? And in order to do that, as we saw from the Aichi examples, identifying and agreeing on these elements at an early stage will help us to define, in the end, what success looks like in the case of the goals and targets. And then taking that to the context of the monitoring framework, if the monitoring framework is really going to be the comprehensive mechanism to be able to monitor effectively the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework, then in principle, it should be able and capable to address all of the elements of the goals and targets to enable that comprehensive reporting. Also, but specifically in the context of the gap analysis, defining those elements now and relating them to the available indicators helps to identify where additional indicators may be needed. Having said that, of course, another advantage in a way of generating these elements now is it enables prioritization at the country level for parties who may have a priority set of elements which it's more important in that national context to ensure it can be measured through indicators. So it's not saying necessarily that absolutely every single element needs to be prioritized and measured in every case. So it's a framework to support that prioritization of indicators and of monitoring. So how did we do that? Well, really the starting point was something of a textual analysis of what are often, as we mentioned, very complex, very complicatedly worded targets. There are lots of sub-clauses, there are lists. In some cases, when you analyze it, you realize that some parts of the target really refer to actions and other parts refer to outcomes or outputs. And so it's that sort of passing of the wording of a target which can help to analyze really what it was that the parties agreed to in the wording of the framework. And the guiding thought and principle in making those choices was to ask the question, what would need to be monitored separately to evaluate whether the goal or target has been fully met? So that was broadly the question going through our minds as we attempted to identify the elements. So the process was there was a kind of first draft, the first version, if you like, of the proposed elements for all of the goals and targets. That went through a kind of internal peer review across the the RTEG enabling a tremendous range of expertise to be brought to bear to refine and improve those initial suggestions. And the outcome was identification of a very large number of elements, 186 elements running across the 4 goals and 23 targets. So that's an average of nearly 7 elements per target. But because of the difference among the targets and goals, there was quite a wide variation. So the number of elements per goal or target ranged from 4 at the lowest to 13 at the highest. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm just going to go through 3 examples to help to define and explain the logic of how these elements were decided. The full list of these will be available in the information document for Subster that will accompany the gap analysis. So I've used color coding here to help to relate and to link what the wording of the target itself, or the goal, in this case, goal A on the left, with the proposed elements on the right. So, for example, if we take the beginning of goal A, it says the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored. So if we take that, it's one phrase, but it's actually 3 different things. So if we're really going to measure the achievement fully in that particular case, we need to measure the integrity, we need to measure the connectivity, and we need to measure the resilience. 3 different things to measure. That's why on the right, you can see those are 3 separate elements. And then the remainder of that sentence, again, introduces a new concept, which is the substantial increase in the area of natural ecosystems by 2050, and something else to measure. That becomes a different element. Then we move on to the second section of goal A, and you look at extinction. So human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted. That's a well-defined concept that needs to be measured. And then the next part, by 2050, the extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold. Now, this was an example of where in the first draft of this, we put that as one element. The extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold. But then someone in the RTEG pointed out, actually, those are 2 different things. The extinction rate refers to the species that have gone extinct by 2050. The extinction risk refers to the status, the risk assessment of species by 2050 for extant species. So clearly those are 2 different things, again, which need to be measured differently. That implies different indicators, therefore they're different elements. Then going down, the abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. Again, something else to measure. And then again, you look at the last part, the genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species. Well, that's one phrase, but it's 2 different things. We need to measure genetic diversity within populations of wild species and then separately domesticated species. Again, that implies 2 elements. So I hope that gives a rough idea of why, in the case of goal A, we end up with those 10 elements. Another example with target 6 on invasive species. So again, beginning, eliminate, minimize, reduce, or mitigate the impacts of invasive alien species on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Well, it's one phrase, but again, it's 2 different things. It's impacts on biodiversity and its impact on the ecosystem services. So we suggested 2 separate elements to be measured there. Again, with pathways, identifying and managing pathways. One phrase, but 2 different things to measure. Prevent the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species. That's a distinct element. And then the quantitative part of the target, reducing the rates of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive alien species by at least 50% by 2030. And then finally, the eradication and control of invasive alien species, especially on priority sites, such as islands, but as a separate element. So again, that just by deconstructing the phrasing of that target, we end up in this case with 7 elements. And there's one more example before I close. This is this is the target which had only 4 proposed elements, target 23 on gender equality. So the first part was really the major statement of the target, ensure that gender equality in the implementation of the framework, ensure the gender equality through a gender responsive approach. The rest of that sentence really is, in a sense, a qualifier, a fuller description of what that entails. And then in the second component, in the target, it reads, including by recognizing their equal rights and access to land and natural resources. Again, this was where we had a very constructive suggestion from within the RTEG that where that originally had been a single element, actually the question of equal rights and equal access are two distinct things that should be measured separately. Therefore, they're two elements. And then the final part is bringing in the remainder of that target, which refers to full, equitable, meaningful, and informed participation and leadership. So I'll stop there. I hope that's given some sense of how we arrived at the elements, and I'll hand over to Flavio to take us through how those elements were then used in the gap analysis itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks a lot. Let me start sharing my own slides as well. So here we go. They should be full screen right now.
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to, as Tim said, just pick up where he left off and start talking about how we used these different elements to do the gap analysis and kind of some of the big takeaway messages to note from the results of this gap analysis. So the next step of what we did with the elements that were identified by the RTEG was that during the workshop in Cambridge, so the 6th and final meeting of the RTEG, we had a session where all members were asked to work together in groups on specific targets and goals, and to assess with each of these elements whether there were the headline and binary indicators that were able to track progress to each of them and how they track progress to each of them. And when we didn't have a headline or binary indicator that was able to do that, or that was not able to do that fully, then we also asked them to assess whether the list of complementary and component indicators that was available was able to track progress. And we also asked that when we qualified that indicator was able to track progress towards an element, how that progress was being tracked, whether it was a full tracking or partial tracking, which I'll come to in a second. And so that was done in 2 afternoons with the RTEG in Cambridge. And some of the goals and targets that we were not able to do in that meeting, so specifically goal D and targets 17, 18, 19, and 20, which were worked on by the TEG on Technical Expert Group on Finance Indicators and other groups at the Secretariat with the Cartagena Protocol and the TSC IAG, were then contacted after this meeting to essentially repeat the same exercise. So look at these headline and binary indicators, compare them to the elements, and give us an idea of how good the coverage was. So what we did with all of this information was that then we summarized it, looked at where there were specific gaps, tried to provide solutions, and came up with some guidance that I will refer to at the end for parties to understand how they can improve the monitoring framework so that it does cover as many of these elements as possible. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the 4 levels of coverage that we defined in the gap analysis. So I'm going to use these 4 colors throughout. And essentially what we mean when we say that an element is covered by an indicator, it means that there is an indicator in the monitoring framework that is able to currently inform progress on that element. So the full element is monitored by an indicator. That indicator is available, it's been tested, and it works, and we know it can do the job. On the exact opposite, we've got not at all in red, which is where there is no indicator in the monitoring framework that is currently able to do any progress tracking towards an element. So whenever we have a full gap, that is what we were referring to. Then we've got 2 intermediate states, the upper one being partial in blue, where there exists an indicator in the monitoring framework that is relevant to the element, but it doesn't allow us to track the whole language of the element. So I'll show some examples in a minute, but essentially the indicator might be able to track part of that element, but not the whole thing. And then potential in orange is the idea that an indicator could inform progress on that element, but either it hasn't been fully developed, so it's still being worked on, and it hasn't been tested and produced, so we don't know yet that it does the job, but we expect that it will, or it hasn't been tested. So we might have an indicator that's related to the elements, that collects data that's relevant to the element, but it hasn't been used to inform on that element. What's really key to understand between partial and potential is in the intent. What can concretely be done now that would be covered in partial? We have indicators that work, and what could be done in theory later is more to do with the potential description. So to give you an idea of what that might have looked like, I'm going to work through target 12. So I'm going to work through target 12 because it's got 8 elements, and it's got 1 headline, 1 binary, and 1 component. So it'll be easier for us to work on a single slide. So what we can see in target 12, it's got elements looking at increasing the area of green spaces, the area of blue spaces, the quality of green and blue spaces, the access to and benefits from these green and blue spaces. Then we're talking about mainstreaming the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, ensuring biodiversity inclusive urban planning, enhancing native biodiversity, and improving human health and well-being and connectedness to nature. So as Tim walked us through, this is the whole ambition of Target 12, but the headlines that we have are not able to cover the entire thing. So why we split it by headline first and then added component complementary is because the headline indicators are mandatory for reporting in the national assessments, whereas component complementary are optional for parties to choose from. So the first thing we did was look at the 2 mandatory indicators. That is the headline indicator for Target 12 that looks at the access of green spaces for people in cities. It's an SDG indicator that's fully developed and available, although it's still being tested in a lot of cities. And the binary indicator that looks at whether countries have implemented biodiversity inclusive planning, urban planning in their cities. So when we do that, we find that these indicators are able to map onto 3 of the elements. So specifically, 12B is the binary. It maps onto biodiversity and urban planning. And 12.1 is the headline. It maps onto the area of green spaces and the access and benefits from green spaces. Now, what we do from here is look at the coverage. So how good of a job do each of these indicators do in tracking progress to these elements? And obviously, where there are no indicator, we have not at all. So these indicators cannot track progress to these elements. And then when we look at the specific elements that are tracked, what we find is that because 12.1 is focused on the access to green spaces, it's able to partially address right now 12E, where the wording asks for access to and benefits from green and blue spaces. So here 12.1 can inform access on green spaces, but not benefits or blue spaces. So it's partially addressing that element. On the other hand, it's only potentially addressing 12.8 because 12.1, the headline indicator, does not actually quantify the area of green spaces. But in quantifying access to green spaces, there is information that is being collected that could be useful to understand the area of green spaces. So we have a potential coverage here of 12A if we were to expand the headline indicator or use its data to also assess area. On the other hand, the fact that ensuring biodiversity urban planning is happening is covered by the binary indicator, which specifically counts the number of countries that have implemented biodiversity inclusive planning. So this isn't looking at whether that biodiversity inclusive urban planning is having any outcomes. It's just looking at whether or not it is there, and that is what the target is asking for. So we have full coverage. So for those that now aren't being tracked by the headline and binary indicators, what we do is that we look at the available component complementary indicators for Target 12. And Target 12 only has 1 component indicator, the Singapore Index, also known as the City Biodiversity Index, which does a lot of things and quantifies a lot of measures of biodiversity in cities, and does provide information about the area of both green and blue spaces, the conservation and sustainable use and biodiversity, and the enhancement of biodiversity. So here we map it on all of these elements. And again, when we reassess coverage, we find that the Singapore Index essentially offers partial coverage for each of them. And we can update the overall coverage. So from coverage step 1 to coverage step 2, where we consider the whole monitoring framework together. So both headline, binary, and component complementary indicators, and we get a sense of coverage that is improved with only a handful of gaps left over for target 12. So those gaps are the elements where we don't have any indicators. And then what we did is essentially repeat this approach. So the RTEG members in groups during that workshop in Cambridge repeated this approach for every single target and every single goal, looking at its headline and binary indicators and their coverage, and then the component complementary indicators and their coverage to get a sense of how good the monitoring framework is doing and what is missing and how we can improve it. So overall, what we found is that essentially there is a relatively good coverage of the monitoring framework throughout the global biodiversity framework. The best coverage that we can get is when we put all of these indicators together, so not focusing only on headline and binary indicators, and that there's a different meaning to what partial or potential means. So there's different reasons why elements might be partially covered, which will require different solutions that I'm going to work through. And there are easy ways to make partial better in many cases. So there are low-hanging fruits where we can put some effort to improve the monitoring framework. And finally, there do exist some gaps that are not currently covered by the monitoring framework. That's regardless of whether we use only headline and binary or if we use all of the indicators together. So as a little summary, here what we have is a pie chart of the coverage of the monitoring framework when we look only at the mandatory indicators. So when we look only at the binary and headline indicators. So what we find is that overall, there's a partial coverage of the monitoring framework with still a relatively large gap. But what's important to remember here is that these indicators are also the minimum set of indicators. They're not designed to capture the entire global biodiversity framework. They're intended to focus on the core parts of these goals and targets and communicate the results to the CBD Secretariat and to the public more broadly in terms of progress of parties. So that is why it's really important to also include this set of optional indicators. And when we do that, we find that coverage is significantly better. So mostly the gaps shrink by about half, and we get a partial coverage of almost all the global biodiversity framework, with still a group of indicators, sorry, a group of elements that are potentially covered that we could work on to improve. Now, what's important to understand is to dive a little bit deeper into these results and look at what does partially actually mean. So what do we mean here when we talk about partial coverage? Because that's not the same for all of the goals and targets. And the meaning of partial and potential does somewhat depend on the indicator type themselves. So for example, in the case of headline indicators, often when we don't have full coverage, it's because either the headline doesn't touch upon all of the sentences or statements in the element concerned. It may be that we don't have disaggregations that could be useful to understand the progress towards that element. These may be for methodological or data reasons, or there's unfinished methodologies. So we might have indicators that are mostly designed but not operational yet, or designed and not fully tested, which mean that we can't confidently say at this point that it is covered, but there is a partial coverage. And then in the case of binary indicators, really what partial means is specifically to do with their nature, because binary indicators are focused on the measures that have been taken to set up the conditions required to deliver on the global biodiversity framework. So what they are asking, these binary indicators, is whether or not actions were taken, structures and processes put in place to deliver on the goal and target, rather than the outcome itself. And in some cases, targets call for these measures. So in this case, global binary indicators do a really good job. But in other cases, they call for the taking of measures and the outcome of those measures, in which case binary indicators do a partial job of covering the element. So to give you some examples, if we look at goal A, specifically here, what we have is a case of incomplete coverage. Overall, we've got a pretty good coverage of this goal by the monitoring framework, but there are still a few elements that are only partially covered because of a few things. For example, the red list of ecosystem assessments for headline 1 do not all assess connectivity and integrity. Some of them do. So if we expanded them fully to include connectivity and integrity, then that would be 2 elements that would be fully covered as well for goal A. In the case of headline 3, we do have information on the extinction rate. That is what headline A3 measures, but not on the number of extinction or extinction risk, even though that could be calculated from the same data that A3 uses. So again, here there's an opportunity to increase the coverage of A3, reusing the same data and improving coverage of goal A. And finally, for A4, we've got a indicator that tracks genetic diversity of wild species, but hasn't been really expanded to include enough different taxa, enough different species, and tested in enough regions of the world to really confidently say that it is able to track the genetic diversity of domestic species. So all of these problems are solvable by increasing the coverage of these indicators, whether that's through data improvements, data collection or methodological improvements. These can be done with the existing indicators, given a little bit more development and effort. Another type of partial coverage is the example of missing disaggregation. So target 6 has a headline indicator that's focused on the rates of establishment of rates of introduction and establishment of invasive alien species. And if you remember from Tim's presentation just before, we also saw that target 6 is asking for specific locations, such as priority species and pathways of establishment. So those, in a way, are disaggregations of 6.1. They are additional information that if it was collected along with the data needed for 6.1, we would be able to inform on these elements. So they could move from potential to partial or even from potential to covered if we were collecting that information to be able to do these disaggregations. So in some cases, for other indicators, it's a data issue, and in some other cases, it's a methods issue. But if we develop these indicators to include disaggregations, then we would be able to improve coverage for a significant number of targets. And then finally, another issue with some of the headlines is that in a few cases, the targets remain entirely potentially covered simply because the headline isn't available yet. So we have some goals and targets like goal C and target 21, where the headline is designed on purpose to cover most of the target or most of the goal, but it isn't yet available. It hasn't been fully developed and testing. So right now we can only say that it is a potential coverage of the monitoring framework. But if the work on these headlines, so 21.1 for target 21 or C1 and C2 for goal C are completed, then we expect that this entire orange section of the circle could actually go green with a fully developed and functional indicator. And then in the case of binaries, so to come back to what I said earlier, target 8, for example, has got a number of elements that are focused on implementing actions, and then a number of elements that are focused on the results of these actions. And target 8 only has a binary indicator. It doesn't have a quantitative outcome-oriented indicator. So it has a binary indicator that asks about the implementation of measures to reduce the impact of climate change or of climate change solutions on biodiversity. So those parts of the target are quantifiable and measurable by the binary indicator. We can know whether or not these actions have been taken. But all of the other elements in target 8 that are asking for results of these actions, those are only partially informed because we expect that by taking action, we would see results, but we don't actually have a measure of those results by using only a binary indicator for example, for target 8, but there's a range of other targets like this. There's targets 14, 16, 20, 17, and 22 and 23 that only have a binary indicator. So these are really good at giving us a cost-effective measure of progress, but they're not sufficient for outcomes. And how we could improve this is by including additional outcome-oriented indicators So in some cases, these could be component and complementary indicators that are in the framework already, or national level indicators that are being collected and compiled by parties in their own national strategies. Aside from the partial coverage, we do still find that there are some gaps in the monitoring framework at large. So some of these gaps are due to the fact that two headline indicators, 1.1 on the biodiversity inclusive spatial planning and 9.1 on the benefits from sustainable use of wild species, are not available. They were proposed in the monitoring framework, and work has gone into trying to develop them, but for now there is no solution to developing them, either due to a lack of data or to methodological challenges, which means that they cannot provide any information on their specific targets. In other cases, we've got gaps because headline indicators are quite narrow. For example, 5.1 is specifically focusing on wild fish, but target 5 is asking about all use of wild species. So the headline indicator is not able to cover everything. And as you saw for target 12, again, it's narrowly focused on access to green spaces, but target 12 is asking for more than access to green spaces, including blue spaces and others. So we get some parts of the target that still fall through the gaps, even when we include complementary and component indicators. This is often due to really, really broad target requirements. So target 10 has some very good, very functional headline indicators, 10.1 and 10.2, but it still has such a large range of elements with many statements that those two headlines, along with their complementary indicators, cannot feasibly cover the entire target. And then in some cases, we just have elements that simply don't have any existing indicators. And there's going to be more work needed to develop these indicators. An example of that is target 4 that has an element specifically referring to human-wildlife conflict, but currently there is no indicator on human-wildlife conflict included in the monitoring framework. The good news, however, is that there's a lot of organizations globally and nationally that work on these kinds of indicators. So as Tim mentioned earlier, if parties use these elements to identify their priorities, they can then go to groups like the IUCN who have developed indicators for human-wildlife conflict and include those in their national biodiversity strategy and action plans to inform on these gaps that the monitoring framework cannot currently deliver on. So overall, this is a snapshot, a view of where we are at, with on the left-hand side, the coverage of these 4 levels of only headline and binary indicators for all of the goals and all of the targets. And on the right-hand side, that coverage when we also include component and complementary indicators. So on the left, the mandatory indicators, on the right, the mandatory plus the optional indicators. And what you can see is that when we moved from left to right, most of the gaps that we have on the left are at least partially covered when you take the monitoring framework as a whole. And it's also fairly apparent which are the targets and goals that still require more effort when you compare the left and right. Specifically, you can think about target 12, target 18, goal D, where there are more gaps than in other places. But this is a positive news here. Looking at the monitoring framework as a whole, we've got a very good starting point with a lot of information currently being monitored and tracked by these indicators, and a good sense of what isn't and what's missing, as well as some opportunities to improve the partial coverage where we have it. So to leave you and parties with a few recommendations, the ARTEG concluded that one of the key challenges that still is required to fill a lot of these gaps is to build capacity for data collection. This has also been concluded by the survey on capacity needs, and there are quite a few targets and goals where simply the data needed to deliver on the monitoring is not available. Another low-hanging fruit that could be worked on is to develop the methods of these indicators to improve coverage through disaggregation or simply testing. If we put in the time and resources to finish developing these methods beyond the conclusion of the ARTEG's work, then we would be able to improve the monitoring framework in some very specific highlighted sections. There's also a need to finalize those headline indicators that are still in development. This is tied with data collection and methods work, but specifically those two headlines would fill the gap for two underreported targets. And a important consideration for parties is to adopt the RTEC recommendations on the binary text, because the gaps that we identified in this analysis are dependent on this text being kept as it is, or taken with the RTEC's recommendations. If the text for the binary indicators is significantly changed, if new clauses are added in it, or if questions are removed, then this will introduce new potential gaps that we weren't able to assess here. And finally, a key recommendation is that it might be important for parties to include these additional indicators, the optional indicators, whether they're component and complementary or national priority indicators, that will help fill these gaps that are of particular importance to them. Thank you very much. I think I will end my slideshow here and return the mic to James for questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Flavio. Thank you, Tim, for introducing the analysis of the elements. I hope that that has been informative for everybody. Just before we go into questions, I will note that this piece of work is just about to be published as an INF document, INF 19. I literally have it on my desktop at the moment, just finalising the editing on bringing that INF document together. So we will hope to get that out to everybody during the next few days by the end of this week, together with information about the capacity needs analysis and also some work on global biodiversity observation systems. Again, just before I go into comments, there is or questions, there is a comment from Tiffany, who was also a member of the RTEC and in fact led the workshop, the webinar that we did on the Goal C, Section C, I beg your pardon, not Goal C, Section C of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is cross-cutting. Tiffany, if you want to come online and speak, you would be very welcome to do so, or alternatively, I can read out the comment that's in the chat for the record, because it won't necessarily be available in the recording otherwise. If Tiffany can be given the mic, it would be helpful. Oh, please do read. Okay, I will indeed then, Tiffany. Thank you very much. So it's also valuable for us to note that the considerations within Section C, which are to be considered for all goals and targets, are similarly on a range of not partially or wholly covered by existing indicators in the monitoring framework. A full gap analysis of these considerations, like this one for the text inside the goals and targets, may help countries understand how they can report their progress with respect to Section C and what gaps we should address as a global community. So thank you very much indeed for that, Tiffany. Are there other questions or comments that people would like to make? Either raise your hand or please put something into the chat. Thank you. So Carly, so when will this gap analysis and report be made available? Literally in the next few days. So it will be available for SBSTA 26. You will note in my introduction, I noted that there was an issue there with respect to time permitting. This is work that we had to complete after we had finished the last RTEC meeting because of all of the other work on all of the metadata and so on and so forth. There is a question that's just come in. What mechanisms do you envisage to tackle those next steps? Prolonging the RTECs, something new? I think that's a very good question. I think it's one of those points, and Gillian may wish to comment on this as well, about how do we have perhaps a twin track of implementing what we have at the moment, but also looking further forwards towards 2030, because the issues that we've got, that we had within the HE biodiversity targets and what we have now are the same ones. General issues about drivers of biodiversity loss, issues about involvement of different stakeholder groups, and it's really important that we continue to work on those. We're in a much better position in terms of biodiversity indicators than we were when we had the 2010 target, and I think that it would be really useful to continue the work on that. Just to quickly follow up on Carly's question, follow up there, It will be on the CBD Subster 26 website, and we will put the link to where that is in the chat in just a moment if Lisa hasn't already. There is an information tab, and it will be something that we will make sure is available. Thank you, Flavio. So, Gillian, do you want to comment on that question before I go to the other questions that are coming up in the chat?
Yeah. So I think if we look back at Flavio's slide at the end, which I think he very eloquently presented, we had different types of gaps. And so the role of the ATEG really was to look across the entire monitoring framework and to try to take the whole thing forward, which I believe that they have amazingly accomplished this. But the types of gaps that remain are very technical and very specific. And if you've been listening to some of the webinars that we've had so far, each indicator has its own technical specificities. And so if you consider the headline indicators that still have the gaps in terms of their methodology, which is the one on spatial planning and the one on sustainable use of biodiversity, these are of wild species. These are very specific indicators that would require a very specific skill set, the same as the human-wildlife conflict. And so there are different groups that are working on these different topics. And I think that this is the struggle moving forward, or this is what we need to consider as the Secretariat and as parties moving forward, is are there opportunities to just fill these very specific gaps in some of the specific areas that have been identified, and to try to improve the measuring of those specific topics that have already been identified by the ATEG. And so I think in that sense, there is certainly going to be a need to develop some additional methodologies and to continue to develop methodologies. And this is recognized in the SAPSTER recommendation that's coming from the ATEG. It highlights very much that methodologies are never set in stone. You take the Red List Index, which has been around for ages, and it's still being developed and it's still being improved, and there's still a need for capacity building. And that's going to be the case with all of the indicators. So so the trick is really to find the processes and to try and move them forward, which I think the ATEG has really kicked off in terms of getting this operation. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian. Tim, you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the question put in by Anne Vernig, saying it sounds like from your comments you're encouraging organizations outside the ATEG to continue developing methodology for the indicators and to improve data collection and availability. Well, I think I can speak for everyone saying the answer is yes on that. But maybe just to elaborate a little bit also on the second part, I think that something that is really implied and demonstrated, and I think it came out very well in Flavio's presentation with regard to target 6 on invasive species, is that potentially the same process that's going into the current headline indicator, which presently is specifically around the rate of invasive species establishment, could, with enough resources and enough sustainability as a data infrastructure, go further and disaggregate, for example, with regard to impacts and with regard to pathways. But there is a very important issue around capacity and funding and sustainability and support for those data sources, which I think really needs to be taken on board here, because we can talk in theory about how all of these gaps could be filled, but unless there are predictable and sustainable ways of enabling that data to be collected and to be analyzed, then it won't be available. So I think there are really important messages here in terms of the sustainability and the resourcing given to data collection.
And that actually also cross-references very nicely with one of the other webinars that we had earlier this week on global biodiversity observation systems, led by Andy Gonzalez from McGill University, who was also one of the ATEG members. because actually, how do we develop the systems to be able to link the work that's going on at a national level with the work that's going on at a global level? And I think that that is important. Gillian's just noted we're having a webinar on the capacity gaps tomorrow, which is highly related. Absolutely it is. Thank you for that reminder. And just to pick up on the second part of Anne's question there about how can others outside of the RTEC contribute to this process. I think the key point here is about developing and documenting what you're thinking of in terms of indicators. One of the things that we did through the review of the component and complementary indicators that's listed in Annex 1 of the SBSTA 26.2 document is that we removed any of the proposals that we couldn't find online, that we couldn't find a methodology for. And the reason for that is that we wanted to be able to provide advice to parties on what's available now, because if they're looking at how they're going to measure progress in the next year or two, linking into 7th national reports due in February 2026, and similarly with the 8th national reports in, I think it's March 2029, then parties need to be able to have methodologies to be able to implement. But as I said earlier, I think we're going to need to continue to develop methodologies, and there is a lot of people can do. This is not just work that needs to be led by individual parties or led by individual organizations. It's something that many people, many organizations can contribute to. What we do need to do is to then be able to review at regular points and in a structured manner what is useful to be using for parties so that we have some level of understanding of what is out there, what can be used, and what is useful to be being used by parties. So there's a question that follows on from that with respect to, could you advise to stick with the current indicators until 2030 to have at least consistency in reporting until then, or constantly in improving updating indicators, which can pose capacity and consistency issues? That is part of the big picture. That is part of the big problem here. You do need some consistency, particularly between those 7th and 8th national reports. But we also need to be able to develop the position to 2030 when these targets run out. Do we roll these targets forwards? Parties will need to make decisions about what are the targets for the next decade. And in addition, remember, of course, that the SDGs run out at 2030 as well. So there's going to need to be a really big look at what are global biodiversity targets in 2030 and how does that move forward into the following decade. Gillian has put her hand up again, which means I've probably gone off piste. So apologies, Gillian, rein me back in.
No, I was going to actually mention that, I mean, in the national reports, we're asking parties to report a time series. And so you would then not be asked to only report in the 7th national report. You're not asked to only report for 2026 or whatever the most recent data is. You're asked actually to report for as many years as you have data, but a minimum of 2020 forward. And the same would happen in the 8th national report. And so if you, for instance, do not have data on access and benefit on this access and benefit sharing indicators for the 7th national report, in the 8th national report, you still, of course, would be encouraged to enter this information. And this would be the case for all of the indicators. And similarly, if you develop the methodologies further for any of the indicators, but let's say that you had an indicator for the target 12 one that Flavio mentioned on green and blue spaces, and then actually you have, as a country, done a revision and found out that there was an issue with the calculation, you can report the whole way back. So, you know, you could revise this data so that at the time that we do the analysis of the 8th national report, we would be hoping to have the most up-to-date data at that time, but not only for that year, but going all the way back, since we're asking for the whole time series and we're asking countries, you know, if they want to revise data that they've already submitted, they can. And so what this means is in the 8th national report, you're not comparing the 8th to the 7th. You're comparing the data to the time series that's reported in the 8th, going backwards, if that makes sense. Thanks.
So there's also a question from Hayat. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. The gaps on indicators in the SBSTA 26.2 Annex 3, and in this Annex 3 doesn't include all of the gaps that are explained in this webinar. Although I understand that we should negotiate Annex 3 if we need to, what is the next step for other gaps that don't refer to Annex 3? So this document is, or this work that we've been doing is subsequent to some of that. We weren't able to provide a full analysis of the gap analysis in time for the substantive SBSTA document. It's why this INF document is coming out now at the end of April rather than at the beginning of April. So there is work that we will need to do in terms of how do things fit together. I think what I would say is that they're complementary. We've tried very hard not to contradict what we said in the Annex 3 of SBSTA 26.2, but I think that this will provide more information than is available there. Gillian, again, you put your hand up. What would you like to say?
So I think, I mean, Annex 3, the idea is to highlight where gaps exist. And so if you look at what's in the recommendation, it mentions the gaps that are in Annex 3, but my own view is I don't think that should be seen as an exclusive list of gaps, and I don't think that it should be seen, I mean, my own view is I don't think this should be something that's negotiated, as this is really where the ATEG saw the gaps at the time. And so if I were a SBSTA delegate, I think instead of really focusing on which specific gaps, on having a full list of gaps, the issue really would be to encourage gaps to be filled, to make note of the fact that there still are gaps, and to move forward that way would be my suggestion. I mean, as opposed to going into too much detail on that, because I think that would be a rabbit hole that would be hard to get out of.
I think it would be a rabbit hole that would be hard to get out of, and I think we've got quite a lot of other things that we do need to negotiate, and I think that personally I would regard as a lower priority for any discussion, because I think that discussing the detail of the recommendation and discussing the detail of the binary indicators questions hanging over from SBSTA 25, and with the advice that we've also given as a result of the request from SBSTA 25 for more information, is I think the priority for where SBSTA 26 needs to focus its time in the contact group and in terms of its negotiation efforts. If there are no other questions, we are just on time, just over time, so just quickly check whether there are any final questions before we wrap everything up. No, in which case, thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest. I do hope that there will be other people who are able to tune into the recording of this webinar, which will be made available shortly. And I will just quickly check with Gillian if there's anything else that she wishes to add in summary remarks.
So I would just also thank everyone for coming. As we've put the links to all of the webinars in the chat, please feel free to listen to any of the webinars that we've had so far. And I think we haven't mentioned that the workshop on the 11th of May that James has mentioned at the beginning will also be available online or in person.
Thank you.
And so if you're not at SBSTA, please feel free to join that online. I think we're going to send out a notification in the next couple of days with the link so that everyone is also aware that they can join this online. So with that, thank you very much. And it's an amazing amount of work that's been done by the people who presented today and by others who were not here presenting today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would agree. It's very much been team effort in terms of all of the work that all of the ARTEC has done. Huge amount of work, and thank you all very much indeed. Particularly thank you to Tim and to Flavio for presenting this afternoon. Take care, everyone. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.